Hello, beautiful community. Let's connect a little bit together with some bluntness, but also some gentleness, because I know some of you are worried about this business of Ukraine being told to exchange territory for something like NATO membership, or for something else for that matter. And it can all feel confusing and difficult if you're somebody who is committed to an outcome that's a full Ukrainian victory. If you're not committed to that, you're of course still very welcome to this conversation. And this is our second channel where we have casual sort of living room sitting around slow chats that are all about the fact that the process of turning up here repeatedly is what allows possibilities for transformation. And transformation does not mean changing your mind. We're not here to persuade you in the first instance of anything. Transformation means feeling just better about yourself in the way you look at the world, in the way you feel more hope about some of what you're seeing, even though it looks bluntly sort of unlovely. So I've just made a couple of notes to myself about what I want to raise with you, but I want this to be a very sort of soft and non-systematic conversation. So let's give ourselves a little bit of context of where we're at with this conflict, not in terms of our analysis of it, but in terms of sort of how big a thing it is, really. And then we'll say a bit about the statement from the NATO official about Ukraine exchanging territory for NATO membership. And then we'll just say something about the possibilities of stopping the war now via a ceasefire or unilaterally, and then the other possibilities for how this ends, from sort of best to worst case scenarios for Ukraine and perhaps for the world. And then I'll say a tiny bit about what I would do if I were doing something I would never do, which is giving policy advice. So, it's a peculiar situation because the West has, to an extraordinary degree, gone out of its way to center this conflict. And the West has shown a considerable degree of imagination about stopping what it's doing and investing energy in reacting to the conflict. It's shown quite a lot of imagination about that. What it's not shown enormously great imagination about is thinking about what strategy should drive that response. So the response has been very strong. Just in sheer policy terms, it's an extraordinary turnaround of the kind that people would only dream about in other policy domains, for instance, in climate policy, right? Think about that kind of turnaround happening there. But despite the scale and commitment that the West has shown, that scale and commitment have had a reactive rather than a proactive quality, it seems to me. And the other thing that's really important here to understand, just at the level of you worrying about stuff, is that wars are uncertain. And no matter how many things go against you, go for you, or how many things you think should go for you, because you deserve to be backed by major powers and so on, you can always lose. And often doing the right thing can make you lose, and doing the wrong thing can make you win. So there is nothing at the moment that is catastrophically threatening Ukraine's existence, Ukraine's independence, Ukraine's survival. But even that could come into question years from now, right? On the one side. On the other side, unexpected exponential Russian collapse could, take us in the very opposite direction of a rapid Ukrainian victory of the kind that doesn't look on the cards now. So, decisions you take today are going to be crystal clear in the way they appear with time, but not necessarily straight away. Right? Now, there's one kind of worry that I think a lot of you have, and I want to be a bit blunt in dispelling it. And it's very important that it gets dispelled so you think more clearly about this. And that's the worry that Ukrainian kids in apartments have been hit by rockets, that Ukrainians have been deported, that there have been massacres, that the Russians have been narrating this war with genocidal rhetoric that has absolutely clearly impacted their practice too. Ukrainian cultural symbols have been destroyed. We don't know what is yet to happen, right? Are we at the end of the beginning? At the beginning of the middle? Where are we with this conflict? So there is a kind of a feeling, come on, can't you get that this is big stuff, bad stuff, and that you've got to respond with greater determination than you're responding, dear Western powers. And I think this is wrong, because there are certainly some people in the US political system who don't get it, but it's not clear to me that Joe Biden doesn't get it. I don't think there's anything that I've just said that Joe Biden doesn't get. So grasping more deeply how ugly what the Russians have been up to isn't really the point. The point is that the West needs a clear understanding of how it's about them. How this is about Western security. And if it is at all. And if the West does grasp properly that it's about its security, the next question is, well, what strategy recommends itself? What should we be pushing for, right? We can obviously support Ukraine. We can give Ukraine weapons. But what's our end game here? What do we want in a year, in 5 years, in 10 years? Where do we want it? What do we want to happen in Ukraine? What do we want to happen in Belarus? What do we want to happen on Russian territory? Absence of clarity about that is what controls the dial of Western support as well as the practical contingencies. Absence of clarity about whether this is or isn't directly about Western security is what controls that dial. How bad the situation is in Ukraine and how bad what the Russians have got up to makes a difference. It makes you guys angry, for example, right? And your elected representatives to some extent are responsive to that. But fundamentally, that's not the issue. The issue is understanding that there is never a strong argument for helping a country like Ukraine in this situation if that argument is just about what Ukraine needs. No, sorry. It has to be about global security. It has to be about the interests of major powers. Right? So I don't think that grasping more deeply how terrible the Russians have been in their behavior is the point. let's look briefly at what was said. So, Mr. Jensen, who is the chief of staff to Mr. Stoltenberg, said, I think that a solution could be for Ukraine to give up territory and NATO membership to come in return. And then when he apologized for this, he didn't obviously apologize for the point. He apologized for putting it like he did, or for putting it in any way at all. So that apology is about the framing and about saying it, not about it being entirely wrong. So I want us to ask a question: why now? Why is this stuff coming out now? And then we'll look at where this war might be going. So the first thing to understand about why it's coming out now is that Ukraine got an extension from the West. And the extension in cartoonish terms was roughly about this. Ukraine said, hang on, guys, we can win sooner. We can win sooner. So give us a shot, please. Don't give up on the idea that a short-term victory is available to us. Let's give this a go. And the West said, well, we're already beginning to sort of tilt in a direction of, well, is this really going anywhere? And if it's not, how do we bring it to some kind of resolution? But, well, Ukraine needs to be given a chance to have a go again, clearly, so here we go. And, you might think that's a bit condescending, because why should Ukraine's survival in its full territorial integrity be about the whims of various voters in different countries and so on? How can this be? Well, of course it's like that, because Ukraine can't properly defend itself without that Western support. And neutrally speaking, Ukraine is a proxy, right? Not a proxy in the sense that this is a sort of imperial power triggered war, as some of the left in the West like to argue. Not at all, right? Ukraine has agency. Ukraine's agency, in fact, to an enormous degree drives Western policy. Ukraine's got a genuine 100% crystal clear status as an innocent victim of a very weird and ugly kind of colonial aggression. It's defending itself. It's got a fairly compelling and fairly universal anti-colonialist sentiment going in its civic space. But nevertheless, it's only projection of US imperial power that is allowing Ukraine to feel absolutely safe at the moment about retaining its independence, and then give Ukraine a shot of something extra too, perhaps. Now, that just means the term proxy is neutral. It's a good proxy war, and the United States its involvement there is something we should support. And it's very difficult. It's extraordinarily difficult being in an existential conflict that is yet dependent on your backers, who are themselves dependent on the various fluidities in their democratic polities. It's an extremely precarious and scary situation for Ukraine. And then over and above that, back to what we're talking about right now, it's also scary. Well, even if we do get this done, what is the West offering us next, right? What is the future we're being invited to step into, right? And is the West not able to tell us? Or maybe it is, but can we trust it? It'll tell us one thing, and then there'll be a different president in the United States. And then even if we win, we don't even know what kind of geopolitical reality we'll be in. Presumably with Biden, we might be more of an American-oriented European power. If it's not Biden, we might be oriented in a different way. We're uncertain about that, and we're uncertain about the prospect of the war itself, and the prospect that our backers will stick with us. But basically, there was already a bit of a build-up in the corridors of Western power of sentiment about, well, do we begin to look at bringing this to a close? But then there was the feeling Ukraine needs to do this counteroffensive, which is still going on, and we still don't know how it'll end. The second thing that's, I think, very important to mention here is that it may be the case that increasingly Ukraine gets invited, coerced, seduced into exchanging territory for money. That's something it's already something that's widely talked about again in the Western corridors of power, and it's something that you're going to hear much more. If Ukraine is not winning, right? Sentiment, and if you're regular here, you know what my own analysis is, but I'm not going to critique this sentiment now, but sentiment that says, look, maybe it is a wonderful idea if Ukraine can win with our support, but it's not winning with our support. We can't dramatically give it a level of support to make it win. So even if it's not winning, why should we pay billions for a skirmish a mile one way, a mile the other? If we're in a situation where it's 20 miles in favor of Ukraine, 20 miles back in favor of Russia, this is not really justifiable. We're not going to sustain civic backing for this situation. If it's a skirmish where we are propping Ukraine up to win, 15K worth of territory over a course of a year. So, if it's not looking like Ukraine's going to win this thing, we need to start bringing it to some kind of resolution. That political sentiment will grow in the West, and is already growing. But the second point here is that you're going to see more of this business of seducing Ukraine into giving up territory by giving it cash. For example, saying some of the Russian funds we've frozen. If you give up your territory, you can get them. You won't get them if you don't. So that's going to be something that'll appear more. A couple of other points about what's coming. And I know you might be a bit scared by where this conversation is going so far, but this is the reality we're facing, and we'll say a few more constructive, positive, optimistic things in a moment. Two more notes I want to make in this section of why now. The third is a fantasy, and here I'm not going to be soft, I'm afraid. A fantasy of February 23rd, 2022. So how is the world going to go back, dear Western official, to the world before Feb 24? Oh, so you think if you stand with your back to the problem long enough, it might sort of get back in the box. So I don't want to overstate how big a part that is of what's thought in Western capitals, but that certainly plays a role, right? So this is the idea that eventually Putin is going to realize that he's tried to walk into a kind of brick wall. It's no good for him, and he has to begin sort of come into his senses, pulling out and so on. And, I don't want to impose too many analytical remarks at this moment, but that my analysis is that is virtually inconceivable. And fourth thing is, well, it kind of looks like it makes sense to take Ukraine into NATO, but I wish none of this happened, really. I wish we didn't need to take Ukraine. And I mean, what Ukraine's going to influence our, if it's in the European Union, if it's in NATO, is going to influence our foreign policy arrangements in ways that we won't feel safe about, and maybe we'll be able to make sure it doesn't by pressuring it in various ways. But headache. I wish Putin didn't hate. I wish my bank statement. I mean, I don't like. I just wish it didn't look the way it does, really. So there is that. Let's look at what can happen, starting with proposals for peace, ceasefire, or negotiation now. And I think these come in two buckets, and both buckets really are insupportable. Not insupportable just in the sense that they're not good, but they're not going to work at the moment. So the first is a ceasefire arranged with Mr. Putin, or some kind of a peace deal arranged with Mr. Putin. And I wrote a tweet yesterday that I'll just read, not to waste your time. After a ceasefire, Putin would aim to start the war against, and not even necessarily against Ukraine, or not just against Ukraine. So this is not Mr. Putin's whims at work here. This is a restructuring of the regime, partly a restructuring of the state, onto a path that says big war against the West later. Right? And their notion of regime security is rather locked into that too. So, no. A ceasefire for Mr. Putin is an opportunity to reconstitute himself as he waits while the West declines. There is another solution, which is a solution of a kind of unilateral separation. That's to say, Ukraine says, and the West says, screw the Russians, we'll work it out ourselves. We don't seem to be able to push them back. Let them bite off the bit they've bitten off. And what they haven't bitten off goes into a special red line, which says maximal Western security guarantees. So that's either literally or the equivalent of putting all of Ukraine that Mr. Putin hasn't occupied straight into NATO. And I think that's also an unrealistic scenario. I mean, there is one, or at least it's a scenario that is a combination of the unwise and the unrealistic. And I won't break down the weight of both components at this point. I'll just make a couple of remarks. First of all, naturally, this assumes that Ukraine shouldn't be supported or cannot be supported to win. And then it assumes that the West would want that the West would be delighted or even open to take that kind of Ukraine, a broken up Ukraine, into its arms with maximal security guarantees. So what are the other scenarios? And there are 4. I mean, there could be 16 or 3 or 2. So I don't want to be taken too seriously when I say this. Just the way I'll categorize it for now will be 4. A military victory for Ukraine, where Ukraine gains back all of its territories. I still think that's a very interesting and important scenario, even though we don't look to be on course toward it at all. Scenario 2, Ukraine doesn't win, but it fights on, and while it fights on, 2.5 years later, the Putin regime collapses. That's an eminently realistic scenario, right? It's another scenario. Scenario 3, Russia wins after a long war in 2029. And the West's support for Ukraine's declined by then and so on. That does not look on the cards, but what I would say is that the odds of that are not 1%, they're higher than that. 4. Conflict escalates, leading to various scenarios, including global nuclear war. So I think what's hard is the openness of this, right? In terms of different possible scenarios that could occur. And the fact that wars, and complex wars with many different agents involved, as is the case here, are scary in their unpredictability. You can reduce the unpredictability with a clear strategy. I'll say a little bit more about that. Of course, it's scary because it's in Europe, right? But we want to acknowledge things going on in Yemen and Sudan and Ethiopia. And this is the kind of paradox. We're sort of taking Ukraine enormously seriously. The West is taking Ukraine enormously seriously, but not quite seriously enough to get the, to get them to kick the Russians out. Now, if at this point, through all of this uncertainty and through the recognition you can't reduce that uncertainty to zero, and that's part of maturity too, recognizing that, where would we tilt Western policy? And I'm probably going to make a separate video because in almost every conversation we have, I indirectly imply what my recommendations are, but also with the qualifier that they're not, that they're not policy advice. I don't sit here giving policy advice. But let me just give you a kind of a very small nugget, because I actually think that the two components that I think are central to Western strategy, two related components, you already know about. About the first, you know very well if you watch me regularly on the main channel or here. And about the second, you know too, I think, if you watch a lot especially. So I'd be tilting, right, if somebody came to me and said, Vlad, could you give policy advice on this to President Biden? I'd be tilting as much as possible US policy and Western policy more widely toward two things. One is giving Ukraine more support faster, and the other is politicizing the ex-Soviet space. And actually that includes asking much more of Ukraine than we're asking at the moment toward contributing to the politicization of the ex-Soviet space. So I would give more weapons, but also ask more. Right? And what I would ask more is for strategic solidarity with Belarusian forces trying to get rid of the authoritarian imperialist situation there. And indeed, solidarity with the idea that this project needs to be evacuated from the Russian space too. Right? It's difficult for Ukraine to go there. But I would ask for that much more and give Ukraine more weapons and faster. And so what connects these two approaches? And I'm not saying that either is easy to realize, but to go an inch extra and an inch extra more in both of these directions would be my recommendation. What connects them? What connects them is strategy about what outcome we want to see. What do we want to see on Russian territory? What do we want to see on Belarusian territory, right? And I'm centering Belarus here deliberately. It could play a central role in the collapse of this imperial project on the ex-Soviet space. And I would be asking for much more thoughtful engagement with the Belarusian situation from the Ukrainian government. So what connects this business of supporting Ukraine more and pushing more the politicization of the ex-Soviet space. And when I say ask Ukraine to do this, mostly it shouldn't be Ukraine, it should be us doing this too, but we should ask Ukraine to do more as well. But we should be politicizing the ex-Soviet space. And extra military support, right, and this business of politicizing the ex-Soviet space are connected by an imaginative vision of what outcomes we want to transpire there, right? And the degree to which we are failing to politicize that space, and I know it's hard, and I know the Russian opposition themselves are really struggling with this, but I think it is a kind of profound geopolitical tardiness, geopolitical passivity on our part. We should have a picture of what we want, and we should maximize the odds of its realization, even if these odds are less than 50%, right? And obviously what we want is our own security, the security of Eastern European states, and that means shifting the politics on all of that space closer to something like a modern democratic republic, whatever form that takes. And here we can even be neutral about, what happens to Russia in the next 10, 20 years. So that needs to be articulated more. I'll do it more. But that's where we're at now. There's a lot that's very good about this situation. We're enormously exercised and by this war. We're involved. For the foreseeable future, Ukraine looks overwhelmingly safe and secure at the level of survival and independence. But there is this enormous uncertainty over any sort of plus that is added on top of the independence. What more can Ukraine get? What more can we support it to get? And here is where we run into a special lack of imagination that if it were not absent, I think would enormously help us to maximize the chances of a better outcome faster. Lots of love for the moment, and talk soon.